If you or a loved one is living with cancer, you probably have two focal points: how to rid yourself of it and how to prevent it from coming back. You'll get some terrific information today on Cancer Concepts and Complements with Dr. James Belanger. We'll explore natural medicines which may enhance conventional therapies, share cutting-edge research, and offer insight on how diet and natural medicines can play an important role in treating and preventing cancer. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. Now, here is Dr. James Belanger.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Complements. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger from the Lexington Natural Health Center. In case you missed last week's show, I was talking about the resistant mechanisms to hormonal therapies that are used to treat estrogen-positive breast cancer. By the word hormonal therapies, I'm talking about drugs like Tamoxifen, which block estrogen, and drugs like aromatase inhibitors, like Arimidex and Femara, which reduce estrogen levels. But over time, those drugs can help, but over time the cancer does get resistant to that. And so last week's show, I outlined numerous mechanisms of how it becomes resistant and natural things that might help reduce those resistant pathways. Breast cancer cells can become resistant to these estrogen-lowering therapies by doing several different things. One thing that they do is they start to increase their own production of estrogen. There are cells that surround breast cancer cells. They're called the stromal cells. They're like connective tissue cells that surround the breast cancer that can start to make estrogen for the breast cancer if the estrogen is being reduced by aromatase inhibitors or blocked by tamoxifen. And even if they cannot keep up with the estrogen pathway in producing their own estrogen, then they amplify the pathway by increasing other growth factors such as EGF, epidermal growth factor, and insulin growth factor to amplify the dwindling estrogen signaling system. I also gave you an analogy talking about a chicken broth company that's making chicken broth, and they're happy. They're getting plenty of chickens being supplied by them. And then all of a sudden something happens and their chicken supplier is not giving them enough chickens. So that is analogous to breast cancer cells are happy. They're getting all the estrogen that they need, and in comes tamoxifen, and in comes the aromatase inhibitors, and then reduces the estrogen being supplied to the cancer. So what does a chicken broth company do if they're not getting their chicken supply? They start to have chickens on their factory to help supply themselves. Breast cancer cells start to make their own estrogen to supply themselves if they're not getting a good enough supply from the blood. And then what happens if a chicken broth company still doesn't have enough chickens to produce a good, tasty chicken broth? They start to add things to the chicken broth to amplify that chicken flavor. They add MSG. They add yeast extracts. You can notice that on a lot of the chicken broths. And they do that to amplify the little bit of chicken that is in there. Cancer cells will amplify the estrogen signaling system with growth factors such as EGF and insulin growth factor and receptors that they start to express in higher amounts like HER2. And they do that to amplify the little bit of estrogen that they have, that they're making or being supplied with, so that they can continue to grow and proliferate. I mentioned there are natural compounds that may reduce the production of estrogen by the breast cancer stromal cells, things that lower compounds, inflammatory substances. PGE2 is an inflammatory substance breast cancer cells use to make their own estrogen, and there are natural things such as borage oil and fish oils and melatonin that can lower PGE2 production. There are amplification systems such as the EGF and IGF, and there are natural compounds that help decrease those. And I'm going to talk about like Flaxseed, and I mentioned melatonin and curcumin, things like that last week. There are even natural compounds that may even act like aromatase inhibitors or reduce estrogen production in the body. And I briefly talked about grapeseed extract and Ginkgo. So let's continue that talk today. Let's continue talking about more natural things that might make these hormonal therapies work better. And I'm going to focus a lot on diet today. But okay, tamoxifen. Tamoxifen is a drug used to help reduce the risk of a reoccurrence of breast cancer in women, premenopausal women after surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. And they give it for 5 years, and they've done studies for 15 years later showing there's a lower risk of a reoccurrence by 12% average, and reduces the risk of dying from the breast cancer by about 9%. And tamoxifen blocks estrogen receptors. But another thing that tamoxifen does that people don't know about is it actually helps the immune system. It helps the natural killer cells, which are cells I was talking about a couple weeks ago. They are cells in our body that can destroy cancer. They're called natural killer cells, and tamoxifen can increase the activity of the natural killer cells. So that might be another mechanism of action besides it blocking estrogen. Well, there are numerous ways that cancer cells can get around the killer cells, which I mentioned in that previous show. One of the things is TGF. Cancer cells and the stromal cells, those suppressor cells that surround the cancer, can start to produce something called TGF, transforming growth factor beta 1, and that can suppress natural killer cells. Well, sure enough, they found that if breast cancer cells start to produce TGF, then the tamoxifen doesn't work as good. And the reason, because it suppresses the killer cells. And tamoxifen, some of its effects are by helping the immune system. There's a study done in the Journal of National Cancer Institute in 1999 in Nashville, Tennessee, where they measured TGF in breast cancer cells and found that those that were becoming resistant to tamoxifen overexpressed TGF, transforming growth factor. And when they basically got rid of the killer cells in these models, then that resistance didn't happen. That TGF is blocking the killer cells, so it has to work through the killer cells. So we need to measure TGF. That is something you can measure in the blood. It's an important test to measure in any woman that's on tamoxifen or anybody with cancer in general, because if it's high, it interferes with killer cells. If it's high, it's going to interfere with the tamoxifen's ability to stimulate the killer cells. So we don't want that to be high. And that's a test that can be done at a lab like LabCorp is a lab that does it. It's a simple blood test. The blood is spun down, and then they measure this compound in the blood. If it's elevated, there are natural things that can lower it. And I mentioned numerous things that can lower it. But the one thing that has been studied with tamoxifen is resveratrol. Resveratrol is a compound found in grapes. It's in the red wine, it's in chocolate, and it has been studied in animal studies in the Journal of Cellular Physiology 2010 in Taiwan, where they basically gave rats resveratrol, and they found that it increases natural killer cells and making them kill cancer cells better. And in the International Journal of Molecular Science in 2013, they found that resveratrol makes tamoxifen work better by decreasing TGF and helping the killer cells work better. So that is something that has at least been studied. It's possible that other things that lower TGF, like I mentioned, WOB enzyme, which are pancreatic enzymes, might help lower TGF. It might be a useful thing to study with tamoxifen. I have not seen it studied yet. I mentioned shiitake, neem. There's numerous things that have been shown to lower TGF, but resveratrol has been studied. So if a woman has high TGF, it's going to interfere with the tamoxifen. You want to do things to lower that. Another herb that has actually been studied to make tamoxifen work better is ginkgo. Briefly touched on that last week, but they found that ginkgo actually can act like an anti-estrogen in high doses in the body. They've done animal studies on that, showing that it stimulates the breakdown of estradiol, a strong estrogen produced in the body. And in the British or the BMC Complementary and Alternative Medicine Journal in 2013, they gave animals with breast cancer, estrogen-positive breast cancer, divided them into 4 groups. They gave them tamoxifen alone, or just a control group, or different doses, 2 different doses of ginkgo. And they measured the tumors 4 weeks later. And the group that got the high dose of ginkgo with the tamoxifen had a better reduction in the cancer. And it's possible because the ginkgo just helps reduce the estrogen further. Because I talked that cancer cells can make 10 times more estrogen than what's found in the blood, or should I say the stromal cells surrounding the cancer make that. And tamoxifen might not be enough to reduce all the estrogen or block all the estrogen being produced. And even the aromatase inhibitors might not be able to do that. And so anything that might further reduce the levels of estrogen at the cancer site might be useful. And that's how ginkgo seems to work, is it reduces and stimulates the breakdown of estrogen, tamoxifen blocking estrogen, and that might be why the two, at least in the animal studies, have shown to work better. More research needs to be done. Ginkgo has not been shown to interfere with tamoxifen in human studies. They've studied it as to see if it affects the metabolism of tamoxifen in the liver, and they found that it does not. So maybe there's a study on the way where they're actually doing a human study of ginkgo with tamoxifen. Other things that have been studied with tamoxifen, and one of these is a human study. They took 2 B vitamins, niacin, which is vitamin B3, B as in boy 3, and riboflavin, vitamin B2, and coenzyme Q10. And they used them together, and they found out that tamoxifen basically works better when combined with those 3 compounds. How do these things work? They lower blood vessel growth factors. When cancer is starting to become resistant to tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors, blood vessel growth factors start to increase. The cancer stromal cells, the cells surrounding the cancer, and the cancer itself starts to produce blood vessel growth factors to help the little bit of cancer there start to make more blood vessels. And that's one mechanism of resistance to hormonal therapies. And those 2 blood vessel growth factors include something called VEGF, vascular growth factor, and interleukin 8, IL-8. Well, they have found that in a study, Basic Clinical Pharmacology Toxicology 2007, 84 women with breast cancer given tamoxifen by itself or tamoxifen with coenzyme Q10, riboflavin, and niacin significantly reduced the VEGF and interleukin 8 better than just tamoxifen alone. It reduces the IL-8 and the VEGF after 90 days. And then another study in the Chemical Biological Interactions 2005 found they gave tamoxifen with vitamin B2, vitamin B3, and CoQ10, found that it worked better. The tamoxifen alone, after 28 days, reduced cancer by 61%. The group with the niacin, riboflavin, and CoQ10, after 28 days, 70% reduction. So a little bit of improvement there. Well tolerated, easy, simple, cheap thing to possibly add to tamoxifen. Okay, so those are some supplements. Now let's talk about some dietary compounds. There are numerous things in our food that might help lower estrogen production, help our liver metabolize and break down the estrogen to clear it from our system so it doesn't start to build up and influence breast cancer cells. And there are even foods that help with those amplification pathways I talked about. IGF, the HER2, EGF, these pathways that cancer will start to upregulate to amplify estrogen. There are foods that can reduce that. So let's start with one food, and that is omega-3s, omega-3 fatty acids. There's a study done in the International Journal of Cancer in 2002 showing that women with high levels of omega-3 fatty acids in their breast tissue had over half the incidence of breast cancer than women that had low levels of omega-3s. They've done another study in the Journal of Medicinal Chemistry, 2012, showing that these omega-3s, the DHA and EPA, decrease that thing called PGE2. Women that had high levels of omega-3s formed less PGE2 and were more likely to respond to hormonal therapies than women that didn't have a lot of omega-3s in their breast tissue. And we mentioned, if you don't remember from last week or didn't hear it, that PGE2 is a compound produced from a breakdown products of fatty acids found in breast cancer. and it stimulates the amplification of the estrogen pathway. The stromal cells make estrogen for the breast cancer cells, and they can be induced to produce more estrogen by this thing called PGE2. Well, omega-3 fatty acids, if they start to get in the breast and in the breast cancer cells, the cancer cells cannot make as much of this PGE2. So we have all kinds of different fats in our diet, and they have different classifications. I'm sure you heard there's saturated fat and there's unsaturated fat. Unsaturated fat just means there's like these double bonds in the fatty acids. But unsaturated fats include vegetable oils from corn oil, soybean oils, canola oils, and fish oils are unsaturated fats. Then there are things in nuts and seeds, like, walnuts, sunflower seeds, olives, all those things are unsaturated fats. And they have these classifications. There's omega-3, it's just a structural classification. There's omega-6 and there's omega-9. Well, omega-3 fatty acids are found in fish, wild-caught fish, and they're found in grass-fed meats. There's actually omega-3s in various grasses, and if an animal eats nothing but grass, then they get these omega-3 fats in their meat. And so if also an animal that's a pasture-raised, a chicken that's pasture-raised and not fed corn, then their eggs and their meat will also contain omega-3s. And then it will be found in dairy products from 100% grass-fed cows as well. Omega-3s are also found in flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds, if you haven't heard of those, they're little black seeds, and they're found in hemp seeds. So they're found in a lot of different things. They're not just found in fish. But if you have a lot of those foods in your diet, and you don't have a lot of other fats, which I'll get into in a second, then the breast cancer cells will start to incorporate this, because this is all you're eating. You're eating lots of omega-3s. And if they start to incorporate this omega-3 fat, they can't make this thing called PGE2 as much. And if they can't make that, then they can't stimulate more estrogen production. So that's how it works. And so you have to kind of like switch your diet over and turn over all these fats in your body so that you have a lot more omega-3s in your cells. And there is a blood test that can actually be done to see how you're doing, to see if you're good and you're eating a lot of omega-3s. You can measure omega-3 fatty acids and other fatty acids in your red blood cell membranes. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 2007, took 322 women with breast cancer and 1,000 or so controls, and they measured omega-3 fatty acids and other fatty acids in the red blood cell membranes of these people, found that there's an inverse association. Women that had more omega-3s in their red blood cells had lower levels of PGE2 and lower levels of breast cancer. We're unlikely to have the breast cancer. So, and there's a test. It's called the blood spot, and there's different companies. Life Extension Foundation is a company that has that. Omega-3s don't just affect PGE2. They also might suppress those amplification pathways. There's this pathway. It's called HER2. It's a growth factor receptor expressed on breast cancer cells that are starting to become resistant to hormonal therapies, HER2. And they found in the Journal of Nutrition, 2005, that fish oil given to animals also suppressed the HER2 pathway. So it might only not reduce just PGE2, but affect signaling pathways. Okay, we're going to take a break, and we're going to talk some more about omega-3s, other sources like flaxseed oil. This is Cancer Concepts and Compliments. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger.
This is Cancer Concepts and Compliments with Dr. James Belanger. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. If you would like to find out more about the Lexington Natural Health Center, please visit lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. That's lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. Now, back to this week's program.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Compliments. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger. Before the break, I was talking about omega-3 fatty acids from fish oil and how they can basically reduce the production of something called PGE2, which is something that breast cancers use to become resistant to hormonal therapies. And then also, the fish oil has been shown to reduce HER2, which is an amplification pathway needed to become resistant. So it looks very promising that fish oil could be a useful thing to stop resistance to hormonal therapies. Easy enough thing to start incorporating into your diet, eating more fish or taking a fish oil supplement. But it's also important not only to reduce the amount of, or to increase the amount of omega-3s in your diet, but to decrease competitive fats, other fats called omega-6 fats. Okay, omega-6 fats are fats found in things like corn oils, soybean oils, and things labeled vegetable oil. And so they are found in all kinds of, baked goods. And then they're giving corn to animals. Now they're giving cows corn, they're giving chickens corn feed. And so if you eat chicken and red meat and dairy products and eggs from these corn-fed animals, then they will contain a lot of omega-6 fats. Not a lot of omega-3, but omega-6 fats. And then we eat them. And again, if you don't eat a lot of fish, and you don't eat the grass-fed products, and you don't have walnuts, and you don't eat flax seeds, and all you're eating is these grain-fed meats, grain-fed dairy products, grain-fed eggs, and then lots of vegetable oils in baked goods and maybe even on a salad dressing, you're getting lots of omega-6 fatty acids. And they found that omega-6 fats increase the production of that PGE2, and that is not good. This is not natural. We've changed our food supply. We've monkeyed with nature. I'm not a farmer. I know they did that for certain reasons to feed more people, but it seems to be at a cost of our health. And if you can afford and start eating more of the grass-fed products, maybe the price will go down on those, and that will happen more. But those research is leading to show that those foods are better for us. Omega-3s are very essential. And our ancestors used to get a lot more omega-3s than we do. And it's not like you had to eat fish all the time because they had the grass-fed meats and chicken that were just roaming in their backyard, and they're eating the eggs that contain these omega-3 fatty acids. So it's in a lot of things. It's even found in some wild greens in your backyard too, like purslane, for example, is an edible green. You don't see that in supermarkets anymore, but it is a green that you can eat, and our ancestors would eat that. It's very high in omega-3s. That's where the cows get their omega-3s. Well, another omega-3 source besides fish is flax. Flaxseed contains omega-3s, a different omega-3 than fish oil. It's called the ALA omega-3. And so flax oil and the seeds of flax can reduce PGE2 as well because they contain omega-3s. But there's something else in flax that fish oil lacks, and that is something called lignans. If you eat flax seeds, the ground flax seeds, you grind them up in like a coffee grinder or buy them pre-ground, they contain these compounds called lignans. It's the fiber. It's a specific fiber found in flax. It's also found in sesame, but flax really has a lot of these lignans. And when you ingest flax, it goes into your gut, and the bacteria in the gut convert the lignans into these compounds called enterolactones. The bacteria, the healthy bacteria, the acidophilus, the bifidobacterium, the probiotic bacteria convert it. So this brings up a point here that if you don't have that healthy bacteria in your gut, you can't benefit as much from flaxseed. So there is a test. You can do a stool test. I do this in a lot of patients. There's a lab called Genova Labs and other labs that you can send a stool sample in, and they will culture your stool up on a petri dish and see if it grows the healthy bacteria. If it does, well, you're in good shape. And keep taking your healthy bacteria or eating your grass-fed yogurts that has lots of probiotics, or your sauerkraut or your fermented vegetables. But if you don't, a probiotic supplement or something might be worthwhile to take, and repeating the test. A lot of people, there's trillions of bacteria in our gut, trillions, and taking one probiotic pill that might only have 5 billion probiotics might not be enough. It's like throwing a few grass seeds on your lawn. It's not going to really take. So quantity of probiotics is really important. And supposedly, this is Dr. Mercola. You probably have heard of him. He has a website, and he says that when he analyzed some of the fermented vegetables, he found lots and lots of probiotic bacteria in fermented vegetables. So it seems that there are food sources that do have very high levels of these healthy bacteria. But if you don't eat some of those, then there are pills and powders. But quantity, maybe like 100 billion or more of these organisms at least to start culturing in your gut. But these healthy bacteria are needed to convert the lignans in flax into this enterolactone, and it's the enterolactone that may inhibit aromatase, inhibit the enzyme that converts androgens, like something called androstenedione and compounds, into estrogen. So that flax might actually act like an aromatase inhibitor. And it's usually a lot better tolerated than Arimidex and Femara. So it's showing some promise there. But healthy bacteria is really important. They do have some pills where it's already been converted. There's what's called Flax SDG pills where it's already converted, bypassing the bacteria. But the bacteria is important. Also, while we're on the subject of healthy bacteria, estrogen is produced in our bodies, and the liver breaks it down, and the liver removes the estrogen, the metabolites estrogen in the bile. The bile is like the waste product of the liver, dumps it. And where's the bile go? The bile goes into the gut. Well, they have found that if you don't have the healthy bacteria, the estrogens that are found in that bile get reabsorbed back into the system and might lead to estrogen excess, where you have too much estrogen compared to progesterone, and lead to estrogen-dominating conditions like endometriosis, fibroids, ovarian cysts, and breast cancer. So healthy bacteria actually help with estrogen metabolism as well, and then they activate the flax. Okay, there's a human study done in women with 19 postmenopausal women with breast cancer and 13 controls. They gave them a flaxseed muffin containing about 3 heaping tablespoons of ground up flax seeds. And they noticed after a month of doing this study, they did biopsies on the breast cancer, 71% decrease in that HER2, that thing that amplifies when you're starting to become resistant to the hormonal therapies. It decreases that, and it decreases the proliferation rates of the breast cancer by 34% and induced cell death. So that was a human study, short study, but something that needs more research. It also inhibited the insulin growth factor pathway. That's another one of those amplifiers that amplify the estrogen. There's HER2 and there is insulin growth factor. Insulin growth factor signaling levels are reduced with the flax. There was a study done in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2011. This was an animal study where they gave animals either a control diet, they gave animals flaxseed, they gave them tamoxifen with a control, or tamoxifen with the flax. And then after 8 weeks, they looked to see how much the cancer had regressed, and the group that got the flax and the tamoxifen, the cancer reduced greater than just tamoxifen alone. And how did it work? Well, one of the things that they found was that flaxseed reduced the expression of insulin growth factor and HER2. So it decreased those amplification pathways that help cancer become resistant to tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors. There's been a study done so you can measure enterolactone in the blood and to see if you're producing enough of this enterolactone in the gut. And there's a study done in cancer epidemiology, biomarkers, and prevention. 194 women with breast cancer, either premenopausal and postmenopausal, and they measured this enterolactone, this metabolite, this breakdown product of flax produced by the bacteria in our gut, finding that those that had high levels of enterolactone in their blood had lower rates of breast cancer. So compared to the control group, that is, like the control group was more likely to have higher levels of that. So get that flax into your diet, if you want to prevent breast cancer, you have breast cancer, the research showing that it's very good. I have seen, some doctors are still telling people not to have flaxseed. So if you go to PubMed, PubMed.gov, and you type in flaxseed and breast cancer, you'll find nothing but positive research except for one test tube study where they took, a massive amount of enterolactone and they mixed it with some breast cancer cells, estrogen positive, and it stimulated them. But even the researcher said that those levels are not very achievable in the body, even with high levels of flax. But the animal studies and some of these human studies suggest that it's very good. So the test tube studies sometimes lead us down the wrong direction. So flax is high in omega-3s. There's also research showing that walnuts, ingesting walnuts might reduce breast cancer growth, where they give animals a handful of walnuts, equivalent to just a couple ounces, measure breast cancer growth compared to a control, and it didn't stop it, but it slowed it down. So walnuts, and they also have gamma tocopherols, which I had talked about, helping the natural killer cells. So there's gamma tocopherol and omega-3s in walnuts. Hemp seed also is a rich source of omega-3s. Not to my knowledge has been studied for breast cancer, but when I get to prostate cancer, it has been studied. So hemp seed is another good thing to have in there. And then chia seed is a rich source of omega-3. So any of those might be useful things. And then those grass-fed meats. Okay, reducing fat is also really important. It's important not to eat a ton of calories, to be on the slimmer side, because you do make estrogen in fat tissue. The aromatase enzyme is found in fat tissue, and it converts these androgen hormones, which are like testosterone, into estrogen. And so the more fat you have in your body, the more estrogen you're going to make, supply, and then it's going to be harder for the aromatase inhibitors and the tamoxifen to block all that estrogen, and then the cancer is going to get more fuel that way. So there's a study done in 2011 in Orlando, Florida. They presented it at the American Society of Clinical Oncology, showing that women that reduced their fat calories from 51 grams to 30 grams or less had a 24% reduction in their recurrence rates in breast cancer. These were women that already had breast cancer, and they were trying to reduce their rates of reoccurrence. They found that lowering the fat in their diet helped. So, you want to eat flax, you want to eat fish and stuff, but you don't want to eat so much that you get more fat on your body. They did not specify what kinds of fats in this study. Maybe it wouldn't have to go down to 30 grams or less if it was the right types of fats. But bottom line, you want to be on the thinner side. Protects you against that. So, eating lots of green leafy vegetables and beans and small amounts of the fats. Mushrooms, white button mushrooms. Some people think of them as like white flour, but they aren't. I was always taught, white button mushrooms, they're not that healthy for you. But no, that's not what the research is showing. They might help natural killer cells for one thing, but white button mushrooms contain natural anti-aromatase activity. So they inhibit that enzyme that helps make estrogen. And there's a study done in the Cancer Research Journal in 2006 that said that. And it might be there's different compounds, like something called CLA in the mushrooms that might be the active compound. And when they give it to animals, when they feed them white button mushrooms, not anything fancy, that it reduces the proliferation rate of estrogen-positive breast cancer. And there's been a study done in women in the International Journal of Cancer, 2008 in Korea. This was a prevention study, but they took like 300 or so women, and they looked at the consumption of white button mushrooms and found a strong inverse association with the consumption of the white button mushrooms. Basically, women that ate 18 grams a day of some white button mushrooms had half the rates of breast cancer than those that ate none. And if they consumed, or if they consumed mushrooms, white button mushrooms, 3 times a week, they also had half the rates. What's 18 grams? I looked that up. It's 2 white button mushrooms, 2 of them. That's it. So, just put a little bit in your salad or something like that, or your soup, fit that into the diet. That was a day, but if you eat more than that a few times a week, that might also work. So that's a nice, simple, easy thing to do. Another food group that has been studied to reduce risks of getting breast cancer and might help with treating breast cancer are the cruciferous vegetables, those smelly, sulfury vegetables. And they include a very large group. Cruciferous vegetables include broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, collard greens, kohlrabi, arugula, big group, turnips, rutabaga, broccoli sprouts. I think I got them all. I might have missed one, but those odorous vegetables right there. And there's been a study done in Cancer Research, 2003. Women that ingested 2 or more servings a day of these cruciferous vegetables, they didn't specify which ones, had a 50% lower risk of breast cancer than women that ate none. So start eating those cruciferous vegetables. What is a serving, by the way? A serving is basically 1 cup of raw or a half a cup of cooked, or like 3/4 cooked juiced, 3/4 of a cup of juiced, or 1 tuberous one, like a turnip or something like that. So, but not all cruciferous vegetables are as potent as some. There are some that really stand out. Brussels sprouts, kale, collard greens, mustard greens, broccoli sprouts might be the best of the cruciferous group to ingest than turnips or broccoli or arugula. The Brussels sprouts and the collard greens and the kale contain high amounts of this compound called glucosinolates. And they think that these are the active compounds in the cruciferous vegetables. They are these like sugar-based molecules that contain the sulfur. That's what makes the cruciferous smell, sulfur. It's these compounds, the glucosinolates, that might have the activity. And they've been shown to help the body detoxify estrogen better, helps the liver process estrogen, and even reduces some of those amplification pathways that amplify the estrogen signaling, this thing called the AKT pathway. They're even sources of omega-3, not a huge source, but they do contain omega-3s in the same omega-3 that's found in flax. But these glucosinolates are not active until the vegetable is cut or chewed or something. So you got to chew them really good. There's this enzyme called myrosinase that activates the breakdown of glucosinolates into their active compounds. The active compounds are called, ready for this, isothiocyanates. They're compounds produced once you cut or start chewing it. So when you cut your cruciferous vegetable, let it sit like 5 minutes or so before you ingest it, or chew it really well. But if you cut that vegetable and you let it sit there for a long time, then you're going to lose a lot of the activity, because the enzyme in the cruciferous is going to break the glycosinolates down so much that they're going to just degrade to nothing. So this is the problem when you buy broccoli or something from far away, that is, it's sitting on the shelf and it's been picked a week ago. It's going to lose a lot. It's going to lose like 80% or so of its active compounds. If you buy pre-shredded cabbage, 90% or so loss in that. So, if you haven't have a garden, start gardening and put these cruciferous vegetables, especially the ones I mentioned, in the garden, and get them nice and fresh and use them right out of the garden, or buy local gardens and get that instead of buying far away and letting it sit in your refrigerators, because it's probably not going to be that great by that time. And then try to eat them more on the raw side. Don't cook them too much, because when you cook them too much, they also lose a lot of their active compounds. For example, raw broccoli contains 20 times more of these anti-cancer compounds, the isothiocyanate stuff, than the cooked broccoli. So more on the raw side. Even raw Brussels sprouts, you can take them, you can shred them up with like just a knife or a box shredder, and make like a coleslaw type of thing with the Brussels sprouts, because they are better than green cabbage. But a good variety of them, and try to buy local and use them quickly, or grow them in a garden. So those are the best, because there has been some mixed studies. Like there's another study done in breast cancer patients where they gave them cruciferous vegetables after they have breast cancer and didn't find that it reduced the risk of getting a reoccurrence. Well, why wasn't it? They didn't specify. It could have been that they were eating broccoli that was a week old, or they were eating more the lower glycosinolate containing foods than Brussels sprouts and kale and collard greens, or they were cooking them more, that kind of stuff. when they've done studies, a more accurate way of doing a study on cruciferous vegetables is to actually measure these isothiocyanates in the urine. If you measure them in the urine and they're high in the urine, then they found that the people have lower risks of cancer. So there's some issues when you're starting to study intakes of vegetables. Is trying to decipher, was it cooked, was it buy local and stuff like that. But these active compounds are much higher if you don't cook them and you eat them soon after they're picked, and at least you let it sit there for 5 minutes or so before you start eating it, or you chew it really good. And then having the higher containing ones, the Brussels sprouts, the kale, the collard greens, and the mustard greens. Okay, I got to take another break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about soy. This is Cancer Concepts and Compliments.
This is Cancer Concepts and Compliments with Dr. James Belanger. The information presented herein is in no way intended as a substitute for medical counseling. If you would like to find out more about the Lexington Natural Health Center, please visit lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. That's lexingtonnaturalhealth.com. Now, back to this week's program.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cancer Concepts and Compliments. So we've been talking a lot about food for the last 15 or 20 minutes and how foods can help process estrogen and decrease some of those amplification pathways that lead to resistance to hormonal therapies. Flaxseed, omega-3 fatty acids from fish, and the cruciferous vegetables. Okay, now let's talk about soy foods, miso, tempeh, tofu, soy milk. There's a lot of controversy behind this, and I used to say don't have those foods. Didn't really make sense to me because in Japan, traditional Japanese diet, they eat miso soup and put tofu in their miso soup and that kind of stuff, and they have lower rates of breast cancer than in the United States. And women that adopt a Western diet that are from Japan then end up having the same rates of breast cancer as women in the United States. So it didn't seem right to me that soy would be a bad thing. But the animal studies were suggesting that in the test tube studies. Well, there's been more human studies where they've analyzed data better now, finding that no, soy can protect against breast cancer, soy foods, and it can also reduce the risks of reoccurrences. And the problem was that animals in this case weren't the best model to study for soy, is what they have concluded. But now they have the human studies to show that it is good. There was in the 2013, just last year, they analyzed 5 different studies totaling over 11,000 patients and published this in the Asian Pacific Journal of Cancer Prevention, and it was in 2013, finding that women who ingested soy foods that contained at least 10 milligrams of these compounds in soy called isoflavones had a 25% lower risk of a breast cancer recurrence and a lower risk of dying from the breast cancer. And this included estrogen positive, women with estrogen positive breast cancer, estrogen negative, and both pre and postmenopausal women. Now, what are these isoflavones? Isoflavones are natural compounds found in soy, and they include something called genistein and diazine. And so they're found in all kinds of soy products, and the quantities of them vary from the different products. But tofu, soy milk, tempeh, and miso are rich sources. And so in this study, they said that women that had at least 10 milligrams of these isoflavones a day had a reduced risk of a reoccurrence and better survivals. Well, a typical 1/2 of a cup of soy milk or so might have 15 or 10 milligrams, and a serving of miso soup, like a cup of that, a few ounces of tempeh, has about 30 or so milligrams isoflavones. So that's typical. Now, we're not talking having tons and tons of soy, just a bowl of miso soup or something a day, a cup of soy milk, a few ounces of tofu. There appears to be the research showing that the fermented soy products might be better for us, where they've taken the soy and they've fermented it with a mold, the aspergillus mold, to make miso and tempeh over having unfermented soy products. Certainly soy is genetically modified, so you want to get organic, so it's not genetically modified and sprayed with a ton of pesticides. And so that might also be not so good for us about soy, of having the modified forms of it. So how does soy work? Well, soy might act more as an estrogen antagonist. They have studied it, showing that it doesn't affect the uterine lining. It doesn't stimulate, at least a small amount of the soy, doesn't stimulate the uterine lining. It doesn't increase estrogen levels, and it doesn't increase the density of the breast, but that it actually has some natural aromatase inhibition activity. It's been found to synergize and make aromatase inhibitors work better. There was lower rates of reoccurrence in women that combined some soy foods with Arimidex. Soy foods, not soy, pills and stuff. The Canadian Medical Association Journal of 2010 studied aromatase inhibitors with soy, finding that they enhanced each other. Soy also might help with some of those amplifiers. This thing called MMP9, it's an amplifier of the estrogen signaling, and when that increases in the body, that it will help block the effects of hormonal therapies. Soy also might act as an anti-inflammatory. They found that women that had a cup of soy milk a day, then when they went in and they took samples from the breast was producing less amounts of those inflammatory compounds, the IL-1s and the IL-6s and stuff like that. So inflammation induces estrogen production. So I support soy from everything I can read, but just a serving or so, not genetically modified, preferably the fermented ones like miso and tempeh. Carotenoid-containing foods that have those orange pigments, those pigments that include beta-carotene, but there's also something called alpha-carotene. There's been research showing that women were less likely to get a reoccurrence if they had high intakes of carotenoid-containing foods. 2/3 experienced the women that had high amounts of carotenoid-containing foods in their diet had a 33% lower risk of a reoccurrence. That was studied in Cancer Epidemiology in 2009. What are carotenoid-containing foods? It doesn't have to just be orange, but orange foods contain lots of carotenoids. Pumpkin, sweet potatoes, winter squashes, those kinds of things. But they're also found in green leafy vegetables. Spinach, kale, collard greens are also very high in carotenoids, including alpha-carotene. And then there's also another type of carotenoid that's not an orange pigment. It's red. It's called lycopene. That's found in tomatoes and watermelon and red pepper, but mostly tomatoes is the richest source. And that lycopene might inhibit IGF, the amplifier of estrogen, and that the carotenoids might act as aromatase inhibitors. So that might be how they work. If you're into, foraging and eating wild greens, don't pass up dandelions. Dandelions are very high in carotenoids, higher than spinach. They're definitely the kings of the carotenoids. And, just as long as they're not sprayed, harvest them from your yard and eat them, because there's research showing that they can decrease the growth of estrogen-positive breast cancer cells, and it might be in part because of their carotenoids. Seaweeds, that's another thing they eat in Japan. Sea vegetables protect against breast cancer. British Journal of Nutrition, 2010. Women that ingested nori, the stuff that they make the sushi out of, 50% reduction in breast cancer risk when a woman ate nori more than 5 times a week compared to those that did not consume any. They did not find that another seaweed, wakame, did that, but nori, those sheets. So if you like sushi, you get your nori in that way, or they have nori chips and, snacks and stuff. Nori, N-O-R-I. There's also been research done on bladderwrack showing that bladderwrack can actually reduce estrogen levels in animals and bind to estrogen receptors and may act like a natural tamoxifen. What is in sea vegetables that might help? There are these beta-glucans in sea vegetables that might help with the immune system, and there's iodine. Sea vegetables are the richest source of iodine. There's really no other food that compares to the amount of iodine. We add iodine to our salt to get our iodine, but besides sea vegetables, there's cod that has some, but really sea vegetables are important because we really don't get much iodine if we don't have iodized salt. And iodine is one of the active components that seems to inhibit estrogen. And so it does appear that nori, at least, is the one that's studied the most, but kelp might also be good because kelp is very rich in iodine. Last thing I want to talk about is carbs. You don't want to have too many carbs. Carbs, especially those white carbs, are going to increase your insulin, and insulin is an amplifier of the whole estrogen pathway. So watch those carbs. You have too many of the sweets and stuff, can increase your risk of breast cancer by 19%, it says in the Annals of Oncology 2006. Well, I hope you have a better idea of what to eat and maybe what not to eat if you have breast cancer. But check out the book, World's Healthiest Foods. World's Healthiest Foods. Lots of great recipes, give you better ideas of what to do with those cruciferous vegetables and all these other things. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Next week, we're going to talk about prostate cancer. This is Cancer Concepts and Compliments. I'm your host, Dr. James Belanger.
Thank you for joining us this week. Cancer Concepts and Compliments with Dr. James Belanger can be heard live every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Pacific Time, 9 a.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We hope to see you next week for another show.